You're all extremely welcome to Ulster University. I don't know how many of you have actually been in this building before, this lecture theatre before, but if it is your first time, you're very, very welcome. If it's not, I'm glad to see you back. We are very much committed to what we call partnerships with purpose. Our slogan is people, place and partnership. And so part of our understanding of what it is to be a university is to work in conjunction with people outside the university, but also to try to create an atmosphere of engagement and thought and contribution to the wider society. So this event is very much in the mainstream of what we're trying to do, and we are delighted to see you here. Tonight is a Ulster Talks event. Ulster Talks is a brand that we've put around our public events across all of our campuses to try to encourage a sense that this is a place where people can engage with key intellectual arguments, and those can be from any aspect of what a university does. Universities do lots of things, so that can be from architecture to art to science to any aspect of creative industries to politics. I myself, Duncan Morrow, I'm a lecturer or professor of politics here, so this is particularly close to my own heart tonight. And the opportunity to engage with the politics of Northern Ireland in a way which is at one step removed, but also engaged in the reality of real life is very much in the mainstream of what we want to do. So you are all very welcome to this event as an Ulster Talks event. The main item, of course, is to hear from Matthew O'Toole MLA, who is the MLA for South Belfast. He entered the Assembly, I understand, in 2019 in theoretical sense, but it only began, I suppose, in 2020. There's been and in many ways, the whole frame of Northern Ireland politics in the last 7 or 8 years has been punctuated by periods when it is functioning and when it isn't functioning, and that has been something which has caught the attention, I think, of everybody. When does government begin to happen, and how does it happen here in a place where it's so easily disrupted? Matthew, of course, has a long and deep hinterland, both as a commentator, as somebody who's worked in government, as somebody who's done lobbying, who has been involved in public affairs outside of the Assembly. So he is very well aware of the world outside the Assembly. But since 2022, he's been the leader of the Assembly group for the SDLP, and in 2024, that became an informal tense the leader of the opposition, which is itself one of the innovations that has actually happened in the structures that were agreed in 1998. And I suppose for the first time, we've had a year now of the Assembly without interruption. And the opportunity, I suppose, that we felt was to hear from Matthew reflect on that experience and some of the challenges that are still there about getting government to actually function, but also to think about how things might progress in the future. And to help him do that after Matthew has spoken, we have Professor Stephen Farry, who's head of our Strategic Policy Unit here, and who is our co-director, I should say, of the Strategic Policy Unit, and has taken a role helping the university think through how we engage with public affairs and how we make sure that the presence of academic evidence and so on is present in the way we think about the way policy is made. So that'll be a conversation that happens immediately after that. There'll be an opportunity for questions and answers. I hope you all enjoy it, and it only left for me to say, Matthew, you're very welcome. We look forward to what you have to say, and it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Duncan. I feel like a professor should have a mortarboard or something to speak here. I'm really delighted to be here tonight, and I'm really. It's particularly nice to be introduced by Duncan, who is one of the, I suppose, wise men in Northern Ireland, one of those seeing people who always has not just interesting things to say, but I think wise and helpful counsel, particularly for those of us in politics who sometimes despair. Thank you. I'm really pleased, a decent turnout tonight, and I look forward to chatting to you all. I didn't think lectures on accountability and responsibility would be that enticing on a Tuesday night. It's either a positive sign in terms of the engagement of the public here, or it's a damning indictment of the nightlife in Belfast. But thank you in any case for coming, and thank you again to Ulster for hosting this, to Duncan for introducing me, and indeed to Stephen, Professor Farry now, who is going to respond and we'll have a conversation with afterwards. And I'm really pleased this is a conversational talk, but hopefully not hopefully not to the extent that you all get bored and start falling asleep, because I'm aware you're in quite comfortable seats. Stephen, I should say, already looks sort of 10 or 20 years younger, having had the burdens of politics and the stresses of elective politics, having left that behind, or at least for now, and doing his work. And I'll come on to actually mention that and the policy unit here, and I think what it connotes. And I do look forward to engaging with him and the unit going forward. The theme of tonight's talk is accountability, and more generally how we improve our democratic structures and ultimately improve the quality of governance in this region. But before we get on to the meat of that discussion, it's first important to set out and unpack one really important question. We need to establish whose accountability are we talking about. Some of you may have played a popular little quiz in the past, either in the pub or at home, where you're asked to guess the correct collective noun for a group of people. Now, this will be audience participation. You're in comfy seats, so feel free to shout out the answers. It's a flock of sheep. Could be birds, could be sheep. Yes, maybe I won't pursue this audience participation too much. A pride of lions, a troop of monkeys. Now, I will do this as audience participation. What is the correct collective noun for a group of local politicians? David McCann might know the answer to that question.
Sorry, I have to sanitize my answer. I don't know.
The correct. Well, feel free to shout out any answers. The correct collective noun for a group of politicians in Northern Ireland is, of course, no, it's not a shower or a rabble. It is, in fact, a stormont. It's a stormont, or simply stormont. Whenever the executive marked its 1-year anniversary, the question asked in large parts of the media was, how has Stormont done? The BBC asked the big question, 12 months on from the return of devolution, has Stormont managed any real delivery? One is tempted to ask, who and what is Stormont? The literal answer is that it's an area of East Belfast, specifically a publicly owned estate which houses the Assembly and various devolved departments. But of course we know that the noun, a metonym, since we're in an academic setting and I can be pompous and technical, is a term used to describe devolved government in general. It's like Westminster or Holyrood or Capitol Hill. But when it comes to delivery on health or housing or infrastructure, no one in London or Edinburgh or Dublin asks, how is Westminster or Holyrood or Leinster House doing? They ask, how's the government doing? How are ministers doing? How are officials doing? That should be one of the most basic questions in a representative democracy. In an election, we give power to a group of people. After that, we are entitled to hold them to account for what they do with that power. Because elections aren't the only part of democracy. What comes in between elections matters too. But that's the part where our democracy has always struggled. No one elected Stormont, it's just a group of buildings. They did elect a group of people called MLAs, and from those MLAs, the executive is selected. Those are the people, both individually and collectively, we as the official opposition, the media and the public should be holding to account. If our democracy was truly healthy, then the public would see a connection between the votes they cast and the society they live in, the public services they rely on. They would, in short, feel a sense of empowerment and ownership over the political system. I think even the most optimistic booster of the executive would struggle to claim we have anything like a healthy, active, democratic discourse in which those who are elected are given the tools entrusted to make change, then held meaningfully to account for the improvements they deliver or don't deliver, and yes, given credit when they effect meaningful change. So tonight, I want to reflect on why I think, and we in the SDLP think, it's essential that we work urgently to improve the quality of our democracy. That means improving not just the quality of debate and scrutiny at Stormont, it means empowering our citizens to feel like they are active participants in a system that can respond to their needs and priorities. Nor, and this is important, is it just about party politics. It's also about how institutions like the Northern Ireland Civil Service and the media play their part in fostering a healthy democratic discourse and fostering a sense that politics can lead to change in people's lives. In short, I will argue that 27 years on from the agreement, with the world outside utterly changed from the era of multilateralism and international partnership from which the agreement emerged, and UK governments only sporadically engaged in this place, and the public inside the North deeply sceptical, Now has to be the time for our devolved politics to take some responsibility, to be honest with the public about the challenges we face and the decisions that are necessary to deal with them, because we cannot simply drift on as we are, where elections are almost entirely disconnected from the quality of governance and the public services people experience in their day-to-day lives, where so much attention and energy is devoted to whether devolved government will exist or not, rather than what devolved government is actually achieving for people. To be clear, this speech, this talk, is not supposed to be a counsel of despair. There are many reasons to be positive. If I'm allowed to be immodest for a moment, I think one of the reasons to be positive is the presence of an official opposition. I'm in no doubt that we have started to positively shift the culture in our politics and our public debate over the course of our year in opposition. I know from the response that I receive from ordinary citizens, ordinary punters in the street, "You're that Daniel McCrossan," they say. Or, "Are you that guy Joe Kennedy?" Then, once they have established which ginger politician they are talking to, they are very supportive of the work we're doing. Just to give a couple of examples, as you may know, because we've been shouting about it pretty loudly, the executive failed to get even halfway through its legislative programme for 2024. By the way, this target was not getting bills onto the statute book, this was just introducing them onto the floor of the Assembly. And the overall programme for government remains still in draft form 1 year on, with its unsigned off objectives vague and unspecific. Now, legislative programmes, programmes for government, they are, in a sense, the epitome of abstract political things that people talk about, people like me or people in lecture theatres talk about, but they are really critical to allowing ordinary people to feel some kind of sense of a plan being worked on their behalf. In the past, assuming an executive was sitting at all, it would have been left to an outside body to point out these shortcomings. With all major parties represented inside the executive and therefore theoretically accountable for the executive's shortcomings, either there was no incentive for robust accountability, or a party inside the executive would have to become a hybrid internal opposition, holding some power while also regularly challenging and calling out other, usually larger parties with more power. This was a role the SDLP was often perceived as playing in the past, particularly in the years after the St Andrews Agreement. And the truth is that while the specific criticisms from smaller parties like ours were often legitimate, in an overall sense, it probably confused the public rather than increasing accountability. Since we have been the official opposition, we have been a clearly defined force for accountability and challenge. And I believe we've moved the debate away from commentary and internal squabbling between executive parties towards a focus on what's actually being delivered for citizens. And I would also say that the emergence of new and independent bodies and think tanks, some like the Fiscal Council, which have a statutory role, and some like the new policy unit that Stephen and Jodie Carson have established here at Ulster, and indeed Pivotal, and indeed the other new policy institute at Queen's, are examples of a maturing policy debate. They're tentative signs, but they represent progress. Now, it would be easy for the opposition simply to invite cynicism, and there are lots of reasons to be cynical about local politics. But in opposition, we want to do more than simply rage. We want to explain how things can be made better. So tonight will not just be listing challenges. I will come up with a few solutions, and then afterwards you can tell me why they're all the wrong solutions. The broad purpose is to talk about how we make our politics more responsible, more accountable, and ultimately more democratic. That matters not just for the politics of society in the here and now, but it also matters for the complicated and momentous conversations we will be having about the future of the whole island of Ireland and these islands. Now, tonight's talk, I will touch on 4 broad themes: process, power, persuasion, and then finally, and most importantly, people. If you're wondering, I've just listed 4 Ps in order to simply remember headings and to, yes, that's exactly what I've done. But I think the academics in the room will say that's entirely allowed and appropriate to give some structure to your talks. I first became leader of the opposition, as Duncan said, not initially last February when the executive returned, but actually in July 2022, not long after the Assembly election. That was an election in which the SDLP had not done well, to put it mildly. And we were in the surreal position of entering opposition without a government to oppose. Indeed, for the first 18 months of our time in opposition, virtually all of the oxygen in local politics was consumed by the question of whether the DUP would nominate a Deputy First Minister and therefore allow an executive to be formed. The big political question in those years was, what are the conditions that would encourage or force the DUP to re-enter government? What exactly is going on inside the DUP? Those questions took precedence over any other, more than the ongoing crisis inside the health service, more than the crippling cost of living pressures that our citizens were facing. Now, let's leave aside the substance of the DUP's complaints about the protocol, because I spent long enough talking about them for a start, but also because for a few years before that, Sinn Féin we were in precisely the same situation, or a relatively analogous situation with Sinn Féin. The question was then how to get Sinn Féin to re-enter government, and then sort of between 2018 and 2020, the question was how Sinn Féin and the DUP could be collectively cajoled back into office. I don't want to labour the specifics. There were, of course, issues that were of import, fair treatment for the Irish language, RHI. But as with the DUP's more recent collapse, what began as a political tactic, that is the tactic of collapsing the institutions in order to get a policy outcome, what began as a political tactic predicated on a specific demand became a drawn-out negotiation in which the original demands became submerged, almost hard to remember. And the main thing that mattered was the willingness or the ability of the main actors to bring the process to a conclusion. In the most recent collapse, to bring the process, as I said, to a conclusion, and that's a word I want to pause on, process. In the most recent collapse, there were several successive negotiation processes between the UK government and the EU first, then the UK government and the DUP, then, finally, which you'll all remember, an internal DUP negotiation. And I just want to say at this stage of the evening, if anybody is wearing a wire, that's okay. I'm not angry, but it's fine because it's being recorded, so you don't need to worry. You didn't need to bother wearing the wire if you're trying to get the information out surreptitiously, because it's all on the record. Now, by the time the institutions were restored a year ago, a statistically minuscule proportion of the population would have been able to tell you what the DUP's core aims were when they first walked out. I'd almost ask for a show of hands, but I'm not going to. We can talk about it in conversation if anybody wants to be nostalgic about what the DUP's reasons for leaving or their specific demands. And an even smaller proportion of the population would have been able to tell you what the DUP actually achieved from their nearly 2 years of boycott. The fact was that bringing down the institutions was simply treated as another phase of the ongoing and seemingly interminable political process in Northern Ireland. This thing that we've all been talking about, looking at, and sometimes participating in for several decades. It was the same between 2017 and 2020, perhaps even more so. In those years of collapse, there were countless occasions when camera crews and journalists stood outside Stormont House or the Great Hall at Parliament buildings, or in Hillsborough Castle or Downing Street or government buildings. Delegations from parties would troop in, exchange positions, then troop out to repeat the same lines to the waiting media, who were always there to cover it. It fitted with the easy grammar of political coverage here for the previous 3 decades. Eventually, in 2020, a text was bounced on the leading parties and the executive was restored. Between 2022 and 2024, none of the other parties were even participants in what passed for negotiations. I remember seeing Stephen Farry in corridors at the Stormont Hotel in Hillsborough Castle, where we had no meaningful role to play, but a meeting had been called by a Secretary of State or a Taoiseach simply to give the appearance that there was some credible process. That's what passed for politics. While people were struggling to pay their bills, we were going to these strange charades of meetings. These were, as I said, preposterous charades designed to look like multi-party talks. In the absence of any clear route to restoration of devolution, the then Secretary of State, if you can remember him, he is in a better place, Chris Heaton-Harris, would invite parties to roundtable summits at the NIO with no substantive agenda other than a photo op designed to register in the public mind some sort of process. Then, as I said, the parties would dutifully trip out and repeat the same lines to the media. I think it's important for all of us in politics and the media to pause and acknowledge how utterly preposterous all that looked and was Worse, it was shamefully detached from the challenges being faced by ordinary people. Whether they were workers feeling the pressure of inflation, or someone wasting their final good years on a waiting list for a knee replacement, or just a citizen with a vague expectation of some kind of accountable governance. Though the DUP was responsible for that stalemate, there is a wider responsibility that falls on the entire political class, and indeed a wider group. That includes the two governments and the media, for sustaining the idea that politics here is one long drawn-out negotiation. The historic phase of negotiation, which originally led to the agreement 3 decades ago, was what led to the agreement 3 decades ago, and it was obviously brilliantly dramatised in the Owen McCafferty play Agreement. And the stakes and the pressure were enormous and historic, and there are people in this room who were in castle buildings at that time. And of course, after the initial agreement, there began a long sequence of subsequent negotiations at which important and vital issues often needed to be resolved. Leeds Castle, Weston Park, St Andrews, Hillsborough Castle, Stormont House. At times, Northern Ireland politics seemed more like a national trust membership than a mandate for shared governance. 25 or 30 years ago, the public were in large part enthusiastic about dialogue being at the centre of politics. They saw negotiation as a route to peace. It was a peace process, an alternative to the horrors of conflict. But as the years passed, then decades, and now more than a generation since that original agreement, inspirational, almost miraculous as it was, people of all political stripes have grown ever more detached from the idea of politics as a process, especially when that process appears geared towards the interests of political parties rather than ordinary people. It is fundamentally disempowering for so many ordinary citizens in so many ways, and it has to end. And when one of the most effective and repeatedly deployed tactics in the politics of process is to force your point by collapsing the very institution of devolved government, how do we change that? How do we move away from framing politics as one endless process that serves the interests of political parties rather than the people who elect them? Well, first, we need further reform of the functioning of Strand 1 institutions to remove the ability of one party to collapse government. This aspiration is clearly easier said than done, but it's not impossible. So we, along with other parties, including Alliance in particular, have secured a process inside a relatively obscure Stormont committee called the Assembly and Executive Review Committee, a process of looking at how we might make recommendations on removing what's often known as the nuclear veto, the collapse veto. And we might end up talking about that a little bit afterwards. But there has to be more than institutional reform, because changing process isn't enough. Reform can't simply be a political line that we hurl at the big parties. And no change in process will ever be enough if we don't change the culture of how we see and use power in local politics. And to return to the theme of tonight's talk, we need to reconnect power to responsibility. The purpose of power sharing was supposed to be about the transformative potential of working together. That potential still exists and can be harnessed for the public good, because the very fact of sharing power, genuinely working together, can lead to exponentially better outcomes, whether that's the impact of making joint representations to the UK government or collectively ensuring that civil servants are working across departmental boundaries and not in silos. But more often than not, we know today that power is not something pooled and deployed to maximum effect. It's divvied up and jealously guarded by political parties and, it has to be said, by departments. 1 year into the executive's latest incarnation, and political parties have already reverted to the somewhat tedious practice of championing, quote-unquote, their ministers' outlandish achievements, while casting side-eye at the modest work rate of other parties. Now, it's unavoidable that political parties emphasise their own achievements and those of their own politicians, but it only invites ridicule when, as happened in a TV discussion I participated in recently, representatives of all 4 executive parties were asked to comment on executive performance, and then they proceeded to list their own ministers, party's ministers in the executive as being uniquely wise and effective. Not so much My Little Pony as My Wee Minister. This political silo effect is both a product of and a driver of a deeper problem. And that deeper problem is the absence of a clearly articulated and strictly prioritised programme for government. backed by a budget which funds the interventions therein. And where possible, there are containing clearly understood and realistic targets for the public to understand. The fact that there is a draft programme for government at all might be called modest progress, but it isn't progress if it doesn't boil down priorities to a comprehensible and deliverable set of outcomes. It is clear that the most overwhelming issue is the multifaceted crisis in our health service. No short, high-level programme for government document can adequately describe the range of policies needed to reduce cancer waiting times, increase social care capacity, or address all of the other pressures. But it can offer a finite list of actions and targets for the public to understand. But the draft PFG contains non-committal, descriptive text that frankly could have been written by ChatGPT. Under the heading, I'm reading from the draft programme for government now, under the heading, our proposed action, this is our proposed action to deal with the health service crisis, it says, and I quote, these are the first words after our proposed action, it says, the need to improve performance, increase productivity, and improve the quality of care is well understood. And it goes on like that for 2 pages without any discernible outputs or targets. Compare it to the equivalent section of the Republic's programme for government, which says that the new Irish government will, and I quote, and I am quoting here, further reduce waiting times, targeting all patients to be seen within the Sláinte care target of 10 and 12 weeks. First bullet. Second bullet, increase capacity between 4,000 and 4,500 inpatient beds. Third bullet, increase ICU bed capacity by at least 100 beds. Fourth bullet, build 4 new elective hospitals in Dublin, Cork and Galway. And it goes on like that. Now, I am not saying that the health system south of the border is a magic solution or indeed that it is anywhere near where it needs to be, nor am I making any predictions that the coalition government will deliver on these pledges or even that these pledges are necessarily the right ones. But I do know this. I know what the pledges are because they're printed. They're in black and white, clear, comprehensible English. If I was a patient or indeed an opposition politician in Dublin, I would be able to hold the government to account, the health minister south of the border to account on delivery, because I could clearly read across what they had said they were going to deliver to what actually happened in the course of the rest of this mandate. Relatively straightforward democratic exercise in being able to hold ministers to account for what they promised to do. Not only does the absence of clear plans and targets limit the accountability of the health minister, it makes it harder to make the so-called difficult decisions on reform and reconfiguration. Because the public, and I asked the question about this today, because the public are not empowered to make the link between, for example, closing a minor injury unit in order to consolidate a service and a wider plan to reduce waiting times and improve services, because they aren't invited to make that link, they don't make that link, which in turn makes it easy for other executive parties and ministers to slide out of their own accountability for fixing the health service and blame the health minister. Now that's just one example. I have lots of examples, but I'll only give a couple. Another example came a few weeks ago when the Assembly debated a Sinn Féin motion calling for the health minister to deliver specialist autism services. There is nothing wrong with that on its face. It's an extraordinarily important issue. It was promoted widely by the First Minister on social media. The First Minister, who is, by the way, head of government here. This was a non-binding motion which created no legal change and committed no money, not 1 penny, to autism services, nor did it commit to any policy change. The First Minister is perfectly entitled to promote motions brought by her party, but she and her party must know that a casual follower on social media, someone who isn't following the minutiae of parliamentary or assembly process, might assume that a head of government highlighting something happening in a legislature must be significant. It must mean something tangible that might affect them or someone they know in need of such services. It didn't mean any of those things. I can think of no other jurisdiction in which a head of government would think it appropriate to try and garner PR by promoting a non-binding motion calling on a minister in her own government to do something. The First Minister and other ministers have real power to change people's lives, but they trivialise, too often they trivialise that power when they act as if their words don't matter. It's incumbent on all of us to take ourselves and the roles we have, the mandates we have, and the power we have seriously. Just actually occurred to me as it's not in my drafted speech, but today at the Assembly we were debating the budget bill on the subject of us taking seriously the power we have and being honest with the public about the power we have, but also taking seriously the responsibilities that we have. You would think sometimes to watch debates at the Assembly, the slightly pygmy-ish debates that we have at the Assembly, that we had no power. But I'm just going to read from Clause 1 of the budget bill which we passed today, passed today in second stage. It said this bill authorises the use of resources by the persons mentioned in subsection 3 is authorised up to the amount of £41,393,000. So we authorised that today, or we advanced that to the next stage of the legislative process. £30 billion in public money today, and we pass motions that mean nothing, and we pretend to the public that we don't have the power to effect change. We do, but we need to take seriously the mandate that we've been given and the power that we have. We've never properly established a relationship between power, responsibility and accountability, and that is at the root of so many challenges. So what do we do about it? Well, I have a few suggestions. One is a statutory duty to cooperate between departments, and any of you who participated in the Future Politics conference that was coordinated by the Hume Foundation and other organisations just a couple of years ago, I see Tim Atwood at the back, will know that one of the suggestions was a statutory duty between that executive departments have to cooperate. There's a precedent in terms of the Children's Services Cooperation Act, but I think it's something that we could roll out across executive departments to move away from that siloed working. But also I'd like to see a statutory power for the Fiscal Council, which isn't yet itself in statute, and we're still waiting for that to happen. I'd like to give the Fiscal Council, or indeed another body like the Fiscal Council, the power to report on executive core targets rather than simply indicators in a wellbeing framework, which is what they have at the minute. So if you look at the executive's programme for government at the minute, they have this thing called a wellbeing framework, and that contains indicators. It's a little bit like if you're targeting quitting smoking or losing weight or learning a new language, rather than saying, I'm going to learn French, or I will be roughly conversational in French by this date, or I'll have lost a stone by the end of the summer, or whatever the target is. You simply write down, well, what I might monitor is my weight. You don't say that you're going to lose weight or how much weight you might lose, but you simply provide a potential indicator. I think the Fiscal Council or another body could be given that power in statute. I'd also like to see, and we'd like to see in the SDLP, an enhanced ministerial code and pledge of office to embed joint responsibility for delivering the programme for government. But it would be disingenuous to pretend that the disjunction between power and responsibility is only something that happens at the devolved level. The vast imbalance in power between central and devolved government inside the UK and the ability of the UK government to simply disregard the wishes of the people of Northern Ireland and indeed their elected representatives was stunningly illustrated through the Brexit process. And it was illustrated in a way that shocked and offended all traditions in this region. But it isn't just Brexit and its outworkings. Both periods of assembly functionality since then, from 2022 to 2020, from 2020 to 2022, and for the past year, have been marked by UK governments pursuing heedless and damaging policies against the wishes of virtually all local parties. Most obviously, the appalling and now partially repealed Legacy Act, but also the appalling and entirely unrepealed electronic travel authorisation, which is a real risk to tourism in this part of the world. Issues like this underline the importance of robust and diligent representation at Westminster. I would say that, wouldn't I? But they also underline another issue that we need to deal with. In the area of spending, much of what happens between the Stormont Department of Finance and the Treasury is entirely opaque. It's invisible. I'm chair of the Finance Committee, and I have very little information about, for example, the conversations that are happening at the minute about how much money the executive is going to get to deal with the rise in employer national insurance. I don't know. I simply don't know. That's a private secret, effectively, negotiation happening between two parties. There's lots of other information that the Treasury has that devolved government and devolved legislators need to know, but they simply can't find out. So to address that ongoing imbalance and devolution, the SDLP will advocate for a new duty of cooperation between Whitehall departments and devolved committees. The Secretary of State himself, who I'm currently corresponding with about someone from his department appearing in front of my committee, the Secretary of State appeared at this very university just a few weeks ago and made some comments which garnered a lot of attention. And while there was some significant merit to some of his comments and pressing the executive to get on with delivery, which I'm doing myself tonight, it would also be helpful if his own government recognised where it and previous British governments have undermined rather than enhanced public trust in politics here. The Secretary of State's own father used his final speech in the Commons in 2001 to ask a series of essential questions that touch on some of my themes tonight. Tony Benn in 2001 asked, and he said these were essential questions for all democracies. He said, questions that citizens need to ask. He said, what power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how can we get rid of you? Benn's argument was not just that we needed a responsive, engaged executive and legislature, but that we need a healthy, active, democratic debate and ordinary citizens who feel they can affect change, including by influencing their elected representatives, and not just at election times. But do we have that here? Research conducted by Carnegie found that citizens here in Northern Ireland were the least likely in the UK to express trust in politics. Given repeated collapses, that may not be surprising. What was surprising to see was that Northern Ireland, which is a small region where politicians pride themselves on being close to communities and their electors, people here were still less likely than elsewhere to say that they felt they could influence local politics. But perhaps when you put it in the context of decades of politics as a never-ending political process, which incentivizes dysfunction and self-interest, it makes sense. And in the context of some politicians who have had difficulty accepting responsibility and accountability in return for power. It should also be said that certain parts of the media have treated post-agreement politics here as a circus to be pointed at, rather than seriously scrutinised. On the other hand, we do have reasons to be positive. We produce extremely politically engaged and aware young people, some of whom are here tonight, and many of them want to stay in this region and improve it. We have a healthy culture of demonstration and peaceful protest dating back to the civil rights era and before. You only have to look at last year's anti-racist demonstrations and the protests against the slaughter in Gaza, in Belfast and across this region. The local media, particularly those reliant on circulation and advertising, face constant pressure, but we retain a relatively strong regional and independent media compared to some neighbouring jurisdictions. Though the standard of debate in the Assembly is often cringeworthy, there are new and able MLAs in all parties who are genuinely interested in debate, scrutiny, challenge, and yes, persuasion. And I just wanted at that point to pause to acknowledge that tomorrow is the 3rd anniversary of the passing of Christopher Stalford, a hugely talented man with whom I agreed on very little or nothing, but I actually think about often because, not just because of the young family he left behind, but also because of his commitment to and love of debate and argument. I use the word persuasion deliberately, and not just because it rhymes, but not just because it starts with P like all the other themes, but because it isn't a concept that we engage with much in Northern Ireland politics. It often feels here like nobody tries to persuade anybody of anything. Unionists are unionist, nationalists are nationalist, others are neither, but even that can increasingly feel like a dug-in position. And on the so-called difficult questions, whether hospital reorganisation or reform of other public services or raising new forms of revenue to invest in infrastructure, there is little to no political will from the big parties to persuade the wider public why even a mildly unpopular course of action is necessary. Ultimately, this too disempowers citizens and makes a mockery of true democracy, which is not supposed to be about simply reflecting back people's pre-existing views or biases. In the Assembly chamber yesterday, I asked the new Finance Minister what he intended to do to fulfil Sinn Féin's 2022 election manifesto pledge to seek greater fiscal devolution to Northern Ireland. After all, his party has held the finance portfolio for most of this decade and has consistently called for more devolution of fiscal powers, as has the SDLP. An independent commission on the subject, appointed by Conor Murphy, reported nearly 3 years ago, but there is no clear statement of intent from the finance minister or indeed his predecessor. And when I asked this question, John O'Dowd told me in so many words that he wasn't there to be held accountable for the Sinn Féin manifesto, and he effectively dismissed the question. That's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. Not just because of the attitude it reveals to manifestos and indeed elections, but also the attitude to being held accountable for words that are said and promises that are made. The question of fiscal devolution isn't just a geeky budgetary one that gets to the heart of the looming debate my party and the finance minister's party want to have. That's the New Ireland debate. It's critical to the New Ireland debate. If we believe that constitutional change, as I do, is the way to allow more people to fulfil their potential, to live better lives in a more healthy and just society, and to overcome the burdens and divisions of history, to build something new and positive, something better than what we have now, there's going to have to be an extraordinary exercise in democratic engagement and empowerment. We will need to inspire people from all backgrounds, but we'll also need to make and win complex arguments, confront trade-offs, and explain why we believe the benefits of constitutional change outweigh the perceived risks. There is a tendency from some to focus on the actions that need to be taken by governments in Dublin and London. And yes, the Irish government does need to do more focused planning for constitutional change. Yes, the British government does need to provide clarity on the criteria for referendum. But to give them all the power would be to disempower people here. Again, we need to take responsibility for inspiring the debate and generating the kind of active, citizen-led debate that has delivered massive social changes by popular vote in the South and nearly secured Scottish independence in 2014. In Scotland, the wider public debated the niceties of currency unions, fiscal transfers. In the South, in what had been one of the most conservative countries in Western Europe, they confronted and debated previously taboo social questions and made change via popular mandate. The truth is that parts of the political establishments in both London and Dublin have a tendency to see politics in Northern Ireland as mostly about avoiding headaches. And the world beyond, whether in the US or Europe, is not the world it was in 1998, where our small region could command remarkable levels of attention and support. And the dark anti-democratic forces we are seeing globally are not good news for any democracy, including our own. But to deliver a better North, and ultimately the new Ireland I and my party want to see, we're going to have to take more responsibility for shaping our own future. Confronting and debating real choices rather than simply marking time. This place has changed over the last few decades, and immeasurably for the better. But we won't be able to change the North we have now or build something new in the future unless we have a healthier democracy with accountability and responsibility at its core. There are no easy routes or policy levers to pull to generate this kind of societal change, and in many ways what needs to happen is a culture shift which includes all of us in public life and indeed the civil service and the media. Among the ideas that might help and that I've talked about here and elsewhere are an enhanced programme of civic consultation, reviving the idea of the long-forgotten civic forum, running in parallel to the work of the executive, but with more focused work programmes, including areas of recognised complexity, such as healthcare reform and institutional change. A new public service journalism fund is something I've advocated for. It's an idea which arose from a call for evidence that my all-party group on media sustainability undertook in 2021. An enhanced civil service recruitment scheme aimed at getting young graduates and school leavers into public service, inspired by the tackling the biggest challenge, something I feel really passionate about. These ideas, along with the others I've outlined tonight, are proposals that are themselves open for challenge and discussion, and I'm happy to take any challenge and discussion after this, and either tonight or following this. But it is clear to me that for the reasons I've outlined tonight, the huge challenges we face now and the momentous debates to come, the changing outside world, which will not solve our problems for us, and in many cases might make them worse. For all those reasons, we need to inject responsibility, accountability, and real democracy into a jaded politics. An end to politics is merely one unending process of negotiation for the good of parties, not people. A culture of taking accountability for how power is used, not merely holding power, shifting blame and marking time. And a new commitment to argument, challenge and persuasion, both for the challenges of the here and now and for the big debates to come. If there's anything you can say about the people of this region, it's that they're not stupid. They know the challenges we face and the opportunities that lie ahead. They are the descendants not just of a radical, they're the descendants not just of a conflicted past, but of a radical dissenting tradition, which was the intellectual hotbed of this island. Ireland's North Star of debate and dissent. It's time to empower them and reconnect them and all of us to that proud tradition. Thank you very much.
Well, everyone, I'm Stephen Farry and the co-director of Ulster Strategic Policy Unit. I'm going to give Matthew a quick breather for a few minutes after that tour de force, and I'll then ask him a few questions and open the floor as well for your own comments and queries too. But just in terms of myself giving a few reflections on what has been said, where I want to start is actually by paying tribute to Matthew, and I can do this now from my new position, impartial as I am now, post-politics, to reflect on the world more objectively. And the thing I wanted to reflect upon was how quickly Matthew defined the role of Leader of the Opposition twice, both in the wake of the 22 Assembly elections and then once restoration occurred in February of last year. Things could have been done differently in the sense they could have tiptoed their way into it. They could have taken a much more incremental approach, but I think they went in all guns blazing and staked their claim very quickly and set out the parameters of that role. And I think that has certainly paid dividends to Matthew and the SDLP in terms of how they've played their role over the past 12 months, in particular in the Assembly, and staking out what is still relatively new territory in terms of a formal opposition within the Assembly and wider institutional structures. From my own position, I have now left politics and have this new exciting role at Ulster University. But I was reflecting on the way in there today that it's now almost 8 years since I last spoke on the floor of the Assembly. Somebody may say it shows. But one thing that did strike me about that time is back then we actually had three parties that were in opposition. At that time, it was the SDLP and Ulster Unionists within the formal opposition, and the Alliance Party as the unofficial opposition party, just the way the formula worked in terms of the number of seats for qualification in that particular regard. It was said at the time that the DUP and Sinn Féin were getting on better within the executive by themselves without the distraction of what was then termed the smaller parties. Even so much that in the first couple of days of December 2016, Arlene Foster and Martin McGuinness penned a joint article in one of our Belfast newspapers saying things had never been so good. The institutions were never more stable and delivering better than ever. And of course, the next week, RHI broke and the rest is history. So you'd all forgotten about that joint article, hadn't you? But in terms of reflecting upon what has been said, I think it is worth saying that we are facing into a really challenging context for the institutions. Certainly in my time in public life, I've never come across a situation where the range of challenges facing the institutions being greater. We have a situation where the public finances are unsustainable, and outcomes in terms of our public services are poor, to put it mildly. And even in difficult times elsewhere, comparatively, we're in that much more difficult situation. So the time for an opposition to challenge that couldn't be more ripe. In parallel with that, we're facing a very difficult, dangerous international situation, which will have ripple effects in terms of our own institutions as well. For example, we don't know what's going to happen in terms of the wider piece around foreign direct investment and the effects that's going to have on investment on the island of Ireland. And even if it is disproportionately focused on the South, given the nature of their investment profile, we will still feel the ripple effects here in Northern Ireland. Equally, we may be facing into a situation where the UK government are going to have to make a major uplift in terms of defence spending, and how that's then going to impact upon what else happens in terms of public expenditure, again with that impact in terms of the block grant. So I think we are facing into a number of inflection points in terms of how our own institutions respond to those challenges. But within those inflection points, I think we are now at that point where we're asking ourselves, are we potentially moving from a shift from the politics of mere survival, the institutions surviving, not ourselves, to the politics of delivery? Are the public moving beyond the point of merely being satisfied that the institutions are there and functioning, albeit below par, to one where they are demanding that things are done better? And it was kind of Matthew to reference our strategic policy unit in that context, where we are very keen, both as a unit and also part of the wider university, to very much part of that context where we're pushing a stronger focus around evidence-based policy making, and how we can build up that wider network around knowledge exchange between academics and policymakers to really bed down that culture. I think another inflection point is, are we at the point where we can see an evolution in terms of how the structures actually work? Can we see a situation where structures that were set up essentially on the basis of all parties being part of government in order to foment a peace and sustain a peace? And if you look back even in terms of the number of departments that were made back in 1998, the rationale for that wasn't essentially about how government was to best function. It was to maximise the number of people who had a seat around the executive table in terms of inclusion. So are we going to see that shift away from a situation where everyone is in government to one where we have a situation where parties will move in and out of government and in and out of opposition as the other side of that coin, and give that sense of greater choice? And perhaps, given that we are in a university setting, and particularly for my colleagues in politics, to look in terms of what that means from a more theoretical point of view, in terms of what we deem the very rigid consociational model of governance that we have under the Good Friday Agreement. So what that type of shift in terms of our politics means for that model of the consociational theory. And of course, practice often governs what theories say rather than the other way around as such. But all of those changes will pose interesting dynamics for the Assembly in particular. In the past, we had a situation where the committees themselves almost formed the de facto opposition. But this was in the context, as Matthew alluded, where basically the same parties that were in government were also the same parties that were trying to form an opposition. And we had that very confusing situation where parties were not necessarily abiding by collective responsibility outside of the executive, never mind in the executive as well, where their own backbenchers would criticise, in particular, the ministers of other parties, and create a much more fragmented situation. And that does lead itself into the question in terms of what is meant by collective responsibility in terms of the parties themselves. And we talk about that again largely in a theoretical context when it comes to our own institutions. At times that can become very fraught. I suppose it's worth referencing that we have seen a more limited version of that dilemma playing out in terms of the formation of the government, of the most recent Irish government, where we had a situation where one group of independents wanted to have representatives in government, at the same time retain opposition speaking rights for their colleagues at the same time. I was also glad that Matthew made reference to the point around trust and the Carnegie report in particular. And it is important that we do bear in mind that we do have particular challenges in terms of trust, in terms of our institutions. If you look at opinion polls, it is clear that people want to see the institutions in place very strongly, but equally they are very sceptical about the politicians who are currently populating those same institutions. And again, that may seem to be a bit of a paradox. But we are in danger of seeing a growing politics of disengagement, and that is also feeding into a situation where politics is very short-termist. It is quite populist in many senses and growing in some regards, whereas many of the challenges that are facing us at present, climate change being the most obvious one, do require those longer-term solutions. And it does mean that parties do need to bed in around common approaches beyond one electoral cycle and hold their line over many particular cycles. So we are in that very interesting and fluid space. And probably the one thing I'll maybe conclude on before I ask Matthew some interesting questions is in relation to where we go in terms of our institutions. And one thing I have learnt, and this may surprise people coming from the perspective of my previous life in terms of how we pushed reform quite strongly, how you design your institutions and how you set up your rules can only ever take you so far. The key ingredient to make them a success is trust between politicians and a willingness of those politicians to work together for a sense of the common good, and you can debate over what that actually means in practice. But unless you have a series of norms that people abide by, you end up in a situation where the rules are just there on paper and they very easily get gummed up, or you end up with sometimes conflicting outcomes that actually then feeds that whole process of mistrust and takes us backward ever further. So we live in interesting times, and but in that context, I think what Matthew and his colleagues are doing in the Assembly has provided a very new, relatively new and fascinating dynamic, and it will be very interesting to see how it plays out over certainly the next 2 years of this mandate, and who knows what the situation will be in terms of what happens after 2027. So thank you very much, and I'll now move over and ask Matthew some questions. Thanks, Stephen. So hopefully you can all hear me okay, and think of your own questions as well. How we're doing for time, folks? We're okay for a few more minutes?
Yeah, people are good.
Super. So I've 3 questions which I've kept back. Hopefully some of them are slightly tricky. Put Matthew on the spot. It's my chance to be Stephen Nolan or William Crawley for a few minutes anyway.
Stephen Nolan, I don't...
So the first one's probably the easiest one for Matthew. After a year of working the opposition system in the Assembly, do you have any thoughts or reflections on what changes you want to make to the structure of opposition, the resourcing of opposition, and the privileges opposition has on the floor of the Assembly?
Well, yeah, but the leader of the opposition needs a parking space, I think, would be the first thing. And I was going to make a joke about pay, but I'm not even going to go there. Because it would have been a joke and it would have been misinterpreted. No, I don't think that there are very many privileges, I think, that need to change. I think there are a few process things which need to change. What do I think needs to change about how opposition works? I would say the first and most important thing is getting first dibs on responding to ministerial questions, which is quite an important theatrical, but the kind of the theatre of the moment is important because you're kind of holding the minister to account. And I think that is important. I would say there's some of the structures need to slightly. So one thing that could change is the way the Assembly, the way the sitting is laid out. I mean, we're a relatively small opposition. There's only 8 of us. I think it could slightly more clearly delineate where the opposition is in the chamber. Beyond that, to be honest, I don't think there are that many things that I don't have that many complaints about how it works. I think there's a little bit of educating some of perhaps some of the sort of officials, and maybe
we saw the speaker clipping their wings.
Yes, my wings are constantly being clipped by Edwin Pitts. I don't think. I have to say, I think just to be fair to the speaker, I think he acknowledges and recognises the opposition, and he's been generally speaking, relatively supportive. He's obviously well within his rights to clip anybody's wings at any point. But yeah, I think the key thing is educating people that the opposition is there and that we are the official opposition, that we have a job to do. I think at times people thought immediately, like after 2022 in the election, people thought we were doing it to get a bit of attention at times. That it was a bit of like, oh, you're just doing it because that's, you know, it's a thing that we are actually the official opposition. It's an actual designated role. We have specific privileges and we have specific responsibilities. So we need, when I was talking earlier on about people taking their responsibilities and stepping up and sort of and taking their responsibilities and their obligations and their mandate seriously, it's very important for us to take it seriously as the official opposition and be seen to take it seriously. So that means I have to make sure my colleagues are in the chamber and they're ready to ask the first question, and make sure the first question is probing and robust and not just I rise to ask the minister what the time is and what, you know, because some of the questions in the assembly can be a little bit sententious and not very probing. So I think a critical thing is not necessarily change the process, but embedding the culture of opposition and people understanding what it is.
Great. Second question for you, Matthew, is obviously we have very particular structures in Northern Ireland under the agreement, but what sort of reflections do you have in terms of how opposition works in the context of Northern Ireland and our own structures compared to what we see in London or Dublin or Cardiff or Edinburgh?
Well, I think it's really important for us to be, and we use the phrase constructive, and part of the constructive thing is acknowledging, to use the correct term, political scientific term, Stephen, which is that it's a consociational system. It's a post-conflict society. We have mandatory power sharing. In terms of how we do opposition, we need to acknowledge that and kind of calibrate how we oppose, because I think realistically, I'd really hope the SDLP has a great election in 2027, but we have 8 MLAs currently. I'd like us to gain some seats, and I think that's doable, and we're working on that. But we're not going to replace. It's not like they're going to chuck the so-and-sos out and then we're going to be in government by ourselves instead. Even if we were to re-enter the executive with ministers or a minister, we would still be part of a power sharing executive. So we need to be realistic and proportionate. I think a critical thing is acknowledging the limitations they face, the way the spending settlement works from London, the constraints that imposes, the constraints mandatory coalition imposes, acknowledging all of that, as I say, and I said this earlier on, acknowledging all of those constraints, there's still power. You still have £30 billion of spending power. You still have the right to basically legislate on a whole, all the big things in terms of domestic policy, with the exception of broadcasting and core fiscal powers. So there's a huge range of powers they have. For us, it's about calibrating it, and that's a little bit different. So, for example, Anas Sarwar, he wants to be, his aspiration is to be First Minister, presumably in some form, maybe in a coalition or maybe in a minority government at some form in Holyrood. That's not going to happen for me in the SDLP because our system's different. So we have to calibrate it and be a bit more kind of realistic and recognise the structure in which we're operating. So that's why I keep talking about accountability. It's not simply about get the so-and-sos out and replace them with us. It's about accountability and challenge and responsibility. Yeah.
Great. And final question for now. Hopefully you've got your own questions all well formulated. But Matthew, you used the word accountability quite a bit just there now, and also over the course of your own remarks earlier on. And you have framed very much opposition in those terms. Opposition also is about alternatives, and obviously you quite rightly have pointed out that this isn't a case where one set of parties leaves government and a different set, or one party takes over. It'll be a situation where parties move in and out of government and opposition. At what stage do you see a situation where you move from an emphasis which is largely based around accountability, and of course SDLP has its own policies in any event, to one where you are much more forcefully putting out alternatives to what the executive's doing, and of course resources become a constraint in that as well? I
think that's a really important question, and I suppose part of the answer is whenever they come up with detailed policies, we will. That's a bit unfair. That's a bit mischievous, isn't it? No, I think Mark Durkin, who's here, is a phrase he used when he was talking about us doing opposition by proposition and that being an important thing. And we are trying to do all that already. We're not simply saying that's rubbish, not just gainsaying, which people get turned off by, and if they find it really wearisome. I think people, particularly in Northern Ireland, because of the dysfunction, and they don't want just kind of unrestrained negativity and just someone saying, well, that's crap, that's not good, that's useless. They want someone to say, well, no, this is how it can be better. This is how you need to be held accountable better. I think we probably will escalate, as it were, or move into more detailed alternative as the executive hopefully proceeds through more detailed policy implementation through the rest of the mandate. I mean, we've already done a fair bit. We did a document towards the end of last summer, which we called Plan for Change, which then I saw Keir Starmer's government brought out a thing called Plan for Change. I'd like to claim imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but it's a relatively generic title. But the purpose of it was to say, at that point, the opposition had, or the executive had not published its programme for government. So what we, as a parent of toddlers, in the spirit of modelling good behaviour, we produced a short document which had short, relatively focused targets and ideas, and we use that to kind of say, not that this is an alternative programme for government, but this is what we think a plan should look like. It should be a relatively limited list of finite and clear, comprehensible things. I'm relieved in some ways that they didn't then follow it up with their own clear, concise document, but rather a very vague, waffly programme for government. But I think it is about presenting your own alternatives as well as simply gainsaying. In part, I think that's also politically important because people do just turn off. If you're just saying, that's awful, you're rubbish, you're whatever, it really is... to go back to the point I made during the talk, it's disempowering. People feel disempowered from that. They want to hear an alternative idea. They want to hear an argument, not just gainsaying.
Great. Thank you very much, Matthew. Now I'm going to throw it up to the floor with two roving mics on either side. So over to you guys. So question there. Good. Lots of hands. Gentleman there. Right there.
Lecturers have to gaze up a lot. It's actually quite craning your necks quite.
Yeah, thank you both to Matthew and Stephen for their comments. Matthew, I do agree with you that the new decade, new approach and the new programme for government is one fairy tale followed by another damn fairy tale. But having set that aside, what hasn't been mentioned? Look, we have what I would describe as a moronic governmental structure called the Mandatory Coalition. And it's been blessed by what I would call political ineptitude, and inertia has been designed into that system. And in terms of more fiscal powers, I would be an absolute no at this point, because I don't think the political establishment have proved themselves worthy of more fiscal powers. But my question is very much directed at you as a member of the SDLP. I know you've appointed somebody new to your management team. And this is a hard question, but as a Social Democrat, I'm going to feel I have to ask you it. Yeah. With only 8 MLAs, how do you make electoral failure a virtue, even if you too try to disguise it as opposition? I'm on the progressive, pragmatic political left, a Social Democrat, Matthew. So by what matrix will the SDLP judge its success as a party or as an opposition? A party that many feel, including myself, that it's abandoned its working class roots.
Well, tell you what, that was a tough question. But I give a lot of tough questions, so I'm happy to take them. Just to take a few of your points in sort of reverse order. I mean, I don't think we've abandoned working class roots, and I don't think we've abandoned, if the point is that we've abandoned being a centre-left social democratic party, I respectfully totally reject that. That's core to who we are, and indeed it's core to how we've done opposition. The second opposition day that we did, the first one was on institutional reform and improving, stopping the thing collapsing and trying to get, frankly, a bit of accountability out of Sinn Féin and the DUP on that. Then the second opposition day, we did one on poverty, and we were very specific plans. They were costed and they were practical for how the executive could take action, for example, on the two-child limit. So that's, I just fundamentally don't agree with you on our social democratic or credentials. It's core to who we are. But the broader point about our electoral, is this, the electoral position of having 8 MLAs? Well, I mean, there's no big secret that we had a bad election. In fact, I said it up there a few minutes ago. It's not like, this is not something I'm trying to hide, and I don't think that we had a bad election in 2022. We managed to get both of our MPs re-elected, including Claire, our new leader, very handsomely and convincingly. And we also got our councillors in Belfast in particular, some of whom are here tonight, very handsomely re-elected. So, of course, I don't think anyone would deny, and it would be absurd for me to deny that we've had bad elections, but we've also had some bright sparks. And I don't want to get into the whole electoral prospects of of the party, but there are lots of reasons we are positive, and particularly, but not exclusively, our amazing new leader. On the point about opposition and how it relates to our electoral prospects, I would hope, like any party, you do your job in government, outside government, you hope that voters see that and see you doing that job, and that helps persuade them to vote for you. That's what a political party does. There's nothing illegitimate about that. But doing the job of opposition is our job too, fulfilling that role, turning up, doing accountability. A lot of it is pretty unglamorous. A lot of it isn't covered by the media, and it doesn't get any likes on social media either, for that matter. It's pressing, asking questions, and it really does matter. In relation to why we're in it, as I said, this wasn't a decision that we're doing in order to garner relevance. This is, in a sense, the outcome of the election, because we got 8 MLAs, and if you look at the mathematics, we actually had one fewer than than qualifies you for a seat under the Hunt, and we are the official opposition by dint of having, in a sense, 8 MLAs. No secret, no big kind of trying to hide that. Us doing our job in opposition, I hope, will be a critical part of us rebuilding our political brand.
Great. I think we had a question in the middle of the third back row there on this side. You also just put your hands up so I can just see for future reference. Okay,
that's great. Thank you. Matthew, I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about the art of persuasion in relation to Northern Irish politics, and it made me think about how, in the past, in Northern Ireland in particular, the importance of the arts in terms of how people make indirect political critique, and how that helps society develop a sense of political critique. And right now the arts in Northern Ireland are on their knees. We receive half the funding that the UK do. We receive a quarter of the funding per head for the arts. So it feels like a real stranglehold, where that vocabulary of political criticism in an indirect way doesn't have the space to be heard. The plays aren't being written, the poems, the TV shows, these things aren't happening, but they would be elsewhere in the world. And we can think of countless examples of dysfunctional political contexts where the arts have played a crucial role, but here we're watching it kind of just die on its knees. And I just wanted to invite you to say more about that.
Well, I mean, I totally agree. And in fact, Derry Finn, who works with me in my constituency office and is also our arts spokesperson, has done a lot of work on this. It's widely known we are the worst funded in terms of arts in these islands. We're like the fifth or something of what they spend in the Republic. Where I think Wales is the nearest to us, and they spend twice as much as we spend per head in arts. It's shameful, and it's been allowed to happen over successive culture now communities ministers. I don't see it changing very quickly, but it would be a relatively modest, even in a tight fiscal situation, a relatively modest bit of spending. And we will keep pressing. It's something we believe in. Just to go back, the broader point I think is a really important one, which is a sense of stasis in our debate at the minute. And I was trying to kind of get at in my remarks. It feels to a lot of people like there's no real way of pushing things along, generating debate, generating some form of actual practical debate, challenge, discourse. Certainly at Stormont level, it can feel very staid to people. And I think you're right to say that in another context, artists would be kind of responding to that. Now, maybe some of this is the long tail of coming out of a conflict when it's inherently, and then this is a good thing, it's inherently less traumatic and fraught and artistically sensational in one sense to have the work of devolved government, dysfunctional and plodding as it is. But we still have this crisis, in my view, a crisis of kind of democratic engagement and people feeling like the system is in some way responsive to them. And that includes people who make art. So I think it's a generalised question. And in addition to some of the ideas I suggested there, I would love to see more funding of the types of writers who would engage with our politics here.
Okay, that's great. Derry, is that
it was in ours, but it was in ours.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Hi, I'm Paul Smith I work for a charity called Politics in Action. We work with young people, and I want to talk about a problem and an opportunity. So you talk, both of you, about the Carnegie research and the public faith in our institutions and so on. When you look at the data for young people, their faith is even lower for the first time. And I think you should really be taking this very seriously. I think all parties should be taking this very seriously. I think it's quite a big issue. But there is an opportunity, and unfortunately it's not coming the right way. So 12 years ago, the Assembly was the first of the devolved institutions to vote for votes of 16, but it did sweet FA about it. It voted again last year for votes of 16 and still did nothing about it. But the Labour Party has now said that it's going to introduce votes of 16 through Westminster, and we think it's going to happen within the next year, which means that 16 and 17-year-olds should be able to vote in the 2027 council and assembly elections here. And for me, it's a golden opportunity for politicians to have a different kind of dialogue with young people. But a lot of what I experience when I bring young people and politicians together is performative listening. That politicians are happy to meet young people and they're happy to have their photographs taken with them and so on. But in terms of the issues that young people care about, there's been very little traction. I think if we want to move forward as a society, we really need to be ready to take that opportunity. What Scotland and Wales hadn't done that we can now do is get the curriculum sorted out before people get to vote at the age of 16. But a lot of the evidence from Scotland is really compelling. So, for example, people who get to vote at 16 are then much more likely to continue voting through their adult lives. We also know that there's a much more level playing field at 16, that people right across all demographics vote at 16. Whereas as people get older, people from tougher backgrounds tend to drop off the voting. So I'm kind of curious to know, because I'm not sure that any of our parties really set young people's hearts on fire. And I'd kind of like to know what are you going to do about that? And do you see this as an opportunity? And do you see maybe better ways of showing young people that you actually are listening to the things that they care about?
Well, I think, thanks, Paul. I think several things you said really resonated with me. The performative aspect of showing up and doing photo ops and passing motions and telling people that you agree with them and nodding along is, I think, kind of what I was trying to get at there, which is something that I just find unbelievably frustrating, to be honest. I think it demeans our standing for election. Some of what we do in the Assembly, a lot turning up and then doing the photo ops, going up to the long gallery, standing with little boards for photo ops, and then telling people you're going to do something about a thing and then it not happening. I think that invites ridicule, and that's a particular challenge when it's young people, because if they start off cynical, they're unlikely to undo or remedy that cynicism later in life, and that is a problem for society more generally. I hope, like all political parties, I would like the SDLP to be doing more to set young people's hearts on fire, to use your phrase. There are various tactics and strategies that political parties need to do to engage on that. But I without getting into all the tactics of how political parties need to and should engage more with younger voters, I think there's a core thing, which is actually, so to come back to the point I was making about democracy and genuinely trying to foment a sense of meaningful democracy, which has to be complete the whole way through the life cycle of the democratic life cycle, i.e. right the way, not just you are allowed, you vote, but then it doesn't really matter what happens to the vote afterwards, and you as a citizen are kind of disempowered for the rest of the time. I think there is something there about how we engage people properly. Obviously, I didn't mention tonight, but obviously we are strongly supportive of votes of 16. Indeed, the MP for, I think, South Belfast is sitting behind you, so I'm sure she'd be engaging when that comes to Westminster. Look, I will keep pressing on it. I genuinely share this frustration about the performative quality, and I too get my photograph taken with young people, and I love going to politics and action events and engaging and chatting. But I also feel deeply, deeply frustrated that the system we've created just allows for this stasis, and it's something we have to end. And I guess part of me speaking tonight is trying to call it out and move it on.
Okay. Derry, with a woman in black jacket there, just in the middle.
Thank you. Coming as one of the cynical young people just mentioned there now, I come here by myself, representing that demographic, and I do have a question about how Northern Ireland is responding to the violence against women and young girls that is happening right now. I did watch it being discussed in Stormont, and I do have a lot of young girls who are friends of mine, young women who are friends of mine, who have been trying to avail of the services, the charities, and who have been put on waiting lists that are described as months long, including Nexus, including Women's Aid. And we are getting to the point now where we are becoming cynical and nihilistic, and to my dismay, some are becoming violent, and I am terrified. This is not something as optically good to be discussing, but this is not something to be debated. This is something to be very concerned about. And it's the reason that I've come up here, is to get an answer about this, because I look up to you as one of the only trustworthy voices in Stormont at the minute, and your answer does mean a great deal to me. So if you could provide me with any reassurance or any confirmation that anything will be done about it before that is confirmed and the numbers start rising.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming. And it's exactly events like this, and you coming to events like this, that that I'm talking about when I talk about having a democracy where people feel they can engage with their politicians, but also feel there's some meaningful follow through in terms of devolved government. I guess to first of all acknowledge the seriousness of what is happening in terms of the crisis of women on this island, particularly in Northern Ireland, who have been murdered and experienced violence in recent, not just in recent years, it's been going on for forever, but it's obviously been particularly acute in recent years. There is a new violence against women and girls strategy that has been published by the executive. Our job as an opposition is not to necessarily pick holes in everything that's published, but rather to constructively challenge and engage on that and where it needs to be improved. I think there are specific flaws in that we've engaged with the executive on, and we're trying to do that in a way because of the importance and sensitivity of the issue. I don't think it would be constructive for me to, as it were, play politics with it. So that's one area. I think there's specific changes we need to make to the law around rape sentencing and around how all of that works. I think there are other specific concerns in the justice system that we need to address. I think we need to fund the strategy properly. It needs to have clear outcomes, and then I think we need to establish. And I know there is a co-design group with people in the sector, and I meet regularly with people in the women's policy sector to talk about these issues. So that's a very kind of long answer, but it's my attempt to say to you that this is something of the most profound seriousness that we're engaging on as seriously as we can. But I'd be happy to chat to you after and share contact details and have a longer conversation with you.
Can I just add as well, I'm not sure if you're a student at the university, but if you are, if you want to talk to anyone in relation to how the university manages these things, I'm sure the authorities will be very keen to talk to you. This is something that's really important to the DNA of the university, to make sure we are fully inclusive when we address those issues. So if you want to have a chat as well with anyone at the university, we're more than happy to do so in that respect. So just in front of you there, Derry, that woman, and then to that corner over there.
Thank you. Matthew, I'd like to ask you about what is the greatest power that the opposition has in terms of, I was actually asking the person beside me about whether the opposition can actually bring legislation and put it forward. But in relation to that and otherwise, what would you say is the greatest power the opposition has? Because then, of course, you can tell us about how, if it hasn't been used already, how you'd propose to use it, which I think I feel quite confident that you would, but I just need to know what it is.
Well, I'm really glad you asked that, Ethna, because that allows me to kind of re-answer the question that Stephen very helpfully sprung on me, and I hadn't thought it through a good enough answer to the. There are, I think, one thing that one flexibility I would like that. So the way our opposition time works is that we get effectively one day a month, 10 days a year where we control the business for 4 hours which is effectively most of a day's business. Certainly at the minute it's most of a day's business. I would like us to have more flexibility over how we use that. That might include using it to ideally bring forward opposition legislation. I think that would be something. I can see why they might not, because executives and governments tend to have a monopoly, other than private members, on initiation of legislation. But that is something I'd like to look at. I also think we should have, but it might be for a time when there is a bigger opposition than just the 8 of us. There might be some thought given to how you properly resource shadow teams. I'm not having a complaint about the resource. I think we are adequately resourced to do our job now. In the future, it might be that you might want to think about how you would manage shadow teams, to have like full-blown shadows of of individual departments, which we don't have at the minute. And I'm sure there's a whole load of other things that I'm not thinking of.
Great. And the gentleman there in the blue has been very, very patient.
Do you believe, as like the opposition like party or official opposition party, do you think that you have to put aside maybe your representative role, and do you think that maybe you've done enough to get yourself back in next term? And is there anything better maybe you can do, or maybe you've learnt that you could do better?
Well, I hope I haven't a man in South Belfast, and if there's any South Belfast constituents, there are definitely quite a few in tonight. I hope they don't feel of. Like, I think anybody who has a role in addition to your constituency responsibilities, you'll inevitably have to manage a workload where you've got, like, a lot of my time during the first half of the week will be inevitably dealing with stuff at Stormont and being there and holding ministers to account and engaging with the media and ensuring, and I chair a committee too. But no, it's very important, and if you're not, it's everyone's to manage their workload. But yeah, I have a very busy constituency office, and my constituency team are here tonight. And in fact, I've spent some of the day working on an issue to do with the glider that the South Belfast isn't getting. So it seems like I hope I've done enough to get myself back in, but I don't know. That's up to people. And what will then be South Belfast and Mid Down in 2027? Fingers crossed.
So unfortunately, folks, we've run out of time. That was a very interesting Q&A, and often these events, there's a lot of apprehension about hands going up. There's lots of hands up straight away, so apologies to those.
Thankfully, no middle fingers up though,
Yes,
which I was
indeed.
kind of hoping. I thought I might generate some of that, but
I didn't get quite the chance. Matthew's still around for a few minutes alongside his colleagues, so if anyone wants to talk to him informally with their question, please do so. But thank you very much for Matthew for answering the questions.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Stephen.
And back to Duncan.
Listen, I think you can agree with me that this is really a very thoughtful and thought-provoking reflection tonight. And I think, Matthew, you really have put a number of thoughts on the table which really do need to be taken quite seriously. One of the issues, of course, with consociation in Northern Ireland is that it is a project, but it's not yet, or certainly, and a lot of people don't wish it ever to be, a country. And so the question of country over party, which is always the language which is given to you, it's actually quite complicated in a place like this. But is it project over party? And at what point does it become project over party? Because party seems to encapsulate country better than project. So it's a constant issue for a place like this in trying to manage some kind of trust. One of the leaders of your party talked about the ugly scaffolding of the Good Friday Agreement, because without scaffolding, presumably the Good Friday Agreement would fall down. And nevertheless, it is a real question of at what point can you take scaffolding down in a context where it does look sometimes as if you took it down, the alternative would be it would not exist at all. And that dilemma, I think, has been a problem for reform all the way through, is if we take this scaffolding down, we will have nothing left. And so that is something we're going to have to think about, whether we are, in a sense, still dependent on that, because at some level or other, turkeys voting for Christmas requires parties to vote for the potential that their power will be reduced. And that is going to be a complex challenge in any political framework, but certainly for one here where trust is at such a low premium sometimes. So these questions are really important. I was interested in your discussion of, in the end, structures are only part of the way, that in the end, the next part is always a question of leadership. It's a question of people standing up and doing things. And the gap between the absence of violence as the goal of a peace process and reconciliation, tolerance and mutual trust, which is what the agreement says it's for, is actually quite large, and it can only be negotiated by people taking decisions. But I do want to say thank you for putting this on the table. I think Ulster Talks is an open agenda where we invite anybody to come and speak on different topics, but we're always looking for people who are reflective. And I do hope that, far from being pompous and technical, this has been for you an opportunity to be critical and relevant, because that's what we hope that Ulster Talks are actually about. And they give a chance to think at one step removed from the cut and thrust of politics, but also in a context where people are studying theoretically around how can politics work in a democracy. And I think that is a question that isn't just Northern Ireland's now. I think that's very clearly a global issue. So thank you very much indeed for coming here tonight. Thank you all for coming here tonight. I want to say a special thanks to Derry Finn, who has been organising this with us and for us, for Alan for doing the technicalities here, and for Stephen for stepping in and moderating that discussion, which I think was very useful and could have gone on for quite a long time, but the mind can only absorb what the backside can endure. And so it is time for us now to go, and I hope we see you at another Ulster Talks event very soon, and thank you all for coming.